June 1943, Camp Concordia, Kansas. Oberst Friedrich Weber stood at the newly constructed prisoner of war camp's wire fence, his Afrika Korps uniform still bearing the dust of Tunisia. In his hand, he held a slip of paper that his American captors had just distributed to the arriving prisoners. His face, weathered by 2 years of desert warfare, showed not fear or resignation, but genuine confusion bordering on contempt. "Look at this," Weber said to Hauptmann Klaus Richter, holding up the document as if it were some peculiar specimen. "The Americans are going to pay us 80 cents per day if we work." He laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Do they think this is some kind of resort, that we're here on holiday?" Richter, younger but equally skeptical, nodded his agreement. "It's typical American softness. They don't understand that war requires discipline, sacrifice. They think they can buy cooperation with their dollars and their luxuries." He gestured toward the camp's interior, where POWs were being shown to barracks that, while certainly prison quarters, were clean, weatherproof, and adequately furnished. "They're too weak to run a proper military operation, so they try to make friends with their enemies." Lieutenant Ernst Hoffmann, a logistics officer who had spent considerable time studying Allied intelligence reports before his capture at Kasserine Pass, offered a quieter observation. "Perhaps we should reserve judgment. American industrial capacity has proven more formidable than our intelligence initially suggested. There may be method in what appears to be madness." But Weber waved him off with the certainty of a man whose worldview had been shaped by 6 years of Nazi ideology and military indoctrination. "Method? There's no method in weakness, Hoffman. We were told the Americans were soft, that their democracy made them unable to wage total war, and here's the proof. They're going to pay us to work, let us buy luxuries at some kind of shop. Meanwhile, our comrades in the Reich are sacrificing everything for victory. The Americans have already lost, they just don't know it yet. They lack the will, the discipline, the unity of purpose. These wages they speak of, it's an admission that they can't command, only beg." Certainty in Weber's voice reflected the propaganda that had been drilled into German forces for years. American soldiers were undisciplined. American society was weak and fragmented. American resolve would crumble under pressure. The fact that German forces in North Africa had been decisively defeated, that hundreds of thousands of German soldiers now sat in POW camps across the United States, somehow failed to dent this conviction. The mathematics of ideology seemed irrefutable. What Weber didn't know, what none of them could have known as they surveyed the Kansas prairie stretching endlessly beyond the fence, was that these wages and canteens represented something far more profound than mere softness. Within 18 months, the system he dismissed with such contempt would become a source of psychological transformation for thousands of German prisoners. The numbers would become stark in a different way. The average German POW in American camps would gain weight, maintain better health than German soldiers in the field, and develop a perspective on democratic society that no amount of Allied propaganda could have achieved. By war's end, over 400,000 German POWs would pass through this system. The laughter at Camp Concordia would become, in its own way, a miscalculation, not of military might, but of values. The cost wouldn't be measured in bodies, but in the collapse of the ideological certainty that made men like Weber so sure of their worldview. The Geneva Convention nobody expected America to follow. The confusion among German POWs wasn't entirely unfounded. The wage system that so puzzled Oberst Weber had its roots in the 1929 Geneva Convention, a document that Nazi Germany had cynically signed but largely ignored in practice. Article 34 of the convention stated clearly, "Prisoners of war shall be paid a fair working rate to be determined by the detaining power." Most German soldiers, indoctrinated in a system that viewed international law as a bourgeois fiction and enemy combatants as subhuman, expected no such niceties from their captors. The German military's own treatment of prisoners set a very different standard. Soviet POWs in German hands died at a rate of approximately 57.5%. Of the 5.7 million captured, some 3.3 million perished from starvation, exposure, disease, or outright execution. Western Allied prisoners fared better but still faced harsh conditions, limited food, and minimal medical care. The concept that a captor nation would not only feed and house prisoners adequately, but actually pay them for labor struck many German POWs as incomprehensible, possibly a trick, or at minimum a sign of weakness. The American military, however, approached the Geneva Convention with characteristic literalism. The U.S. War Department issued detailed regulations. Enlisted prisoners would receive 80 cents per day for labor, with 10 cents available immediately and the remainder held in canteen accounts. Non-commissioned officers would receive higher rates if they worked voluntarily. Officers, per the convention, could not be compelled to work and would receive a monthly allowance instead. Captain James Morrison, the provost marshal at Camp Concordia, remembered the initial German reactions vividly in his post-war memoir. When we explained the wage system during processing, you could see it in their faces. They thought we were insane. One German major actually asked me, quite seriously, if this was some kind of psychological experiment. Another wanted to know what the catch was, what we really wanted from them. The idea that we were simply following international law, that we believed in it as a principle rather than a convenient fiction, seemed to genuinely confuse them. The wage structure itself was straightforward but, in practice, revolutionary. Each prisoner who worked received 80 cents per day in scrip, a camp-specific currency that could only be spent at the camp canteen. 10 cents per day could be drawn immediately, the remainder accumulated in individual accounts. Prisoners could check their balances, save for larger purchases, or spend freely within the canteen's offerings. For men who had spent years in a totalitarian system where the state controlled every aspect of material existence, where luxury goods had long since vanished, where even basic necessities were rationed to starvation levels, the system represented a complete inversion of their expectations. Ernst Hoffmann, the logistics officer who had counseled patients at the wire fence, became one of the camp's more astute observers. Within weeks of arrival, he was keeping detailed notes, observations that would later be collected by American intelligence as part of studies on POW attitudes. One entry from July 1943 read, "The Americans have created something I didn't expect to see in a prison camp, a functioning market economy. Men are making choices about how to spend their earnings. Some save obsessively. Others spend everything immediately on cigarettes and candy. Still others are beginning to trade and barter, creating a secondary economy within the primary one. This isn't the chaos our propaganda described. This is organization on a scale I'm only beginning to understand." The initial wage payments created confusion of a practical sort as well. Many German POWs had never handled American currency, even the scrip version. The decimal system puzzled men accustomed to Reichsmarks and pfennigs. Several camp commanders reported prisoners asking whether they were being cheated because the numbers seemed too small, not understanding that 80 cents per day, while modest, was more purchasing power than many had seen in years of wartime deprivation in Germany. At Camp Alver in Oklahoma, one German sergeant attempted to organize a protest of the wage system, arguing it was an insult to their dignity as soldiers. The protest collapsed within days when prisoners realized that the alternative was no wages at all, and began to understand what the wages could actually buy. The sergeant himself, according to camp records, was among the first in line at the canteen the following week. The legal framework supporting these wages came from multiple sources. Beyond the Geneva Convention, the U.S. military drew on its own traditions and the American cultural emphasis on fair compensation for labor. Army regulations specified that prisoners must not be used for work directly supporting the war effort against their own nation. No munitions manufacturing, no military construction. But agricultural labor, infrastructure maintenance, forestry, food processing, and similar work were acceptable. The wages weren't charity or propaganda. They were payment for real labor that addressed genuine wartime labor shortages in the American economy. By mid-1943, German POWs were working in every state except Nevada, Vermont, and Wyoming. In Nebraska, they harvested sugar beets. In Georgia, they picked cotton. In Oregon, they cut timber. In Louisiana, they worked in rice fields. The labor was hard, often the same back-breaking agricultural work that American farmers struggled to complete with so many men overseas. But it was paid labor, and the prisoners were treated as workers, not slaves. Hauptmann Richter, initially so dismissive at the fence, found himself assigned to a work detail at a local sugar beet farm. The farmer, a man named John Kraus, whose own son was fighting in Europe, treated the German prisoners with businesslike efficiency. They arrived at dawn, worked until mid-afternoon with regular water breaks, and returned to camp. After the first week, Kraus offered the prisoners cold lemonade during breaks, not from obligation, but from the simple habit of treating his workers decently. Richter recorded his confusion in a letter that was intercepted and copied by camp censors. I don't understand these people. The farmer treats us better than many German landowners treated their own workers before the war. We are his enemies. His son may be shooting at our comrades right now, yet he brings us cold drinks and asks if the work is too strenuous. Is this weakness, or is it something else? I'm no longer certain. The canteen system, abundance behind barbed wire. If the wages confused German POWs, the camp canteens astounded them. Here, in miniature, was the American consumer economy transplanted behind barbed wire, a functioning retail operation that, to men from a nation grinding through its fourth year of total war and draconian rationing, seemed like something from another planet. The typical large POW camp canteen carried between 150 and 300 different items. Fresh fruit appeared regularly: apples, oranges, bananas, which many German prisoners had not seen since before the war, grapes, and seasonal varieties. The canteen stocked multiple brands of cigarettes: Lucky Strike, Camel, Chesterfield, and others, at prices that made German prisoners check their math. In Germany, cigarettes had become a form of currency more reliable than Reichsmarks. Here, a prisoner could buy a pack for a few cents from his daily wages. Candy filled entire sections: Hershey's chocolate bars, Lifesavers, Tootsie Rolls, chewing gum in a dozen flavors. Soft drinks included Coca-Cola, Pepsi, root beer, and regional brands. The canteens sold newspapers, magazines, and books. They offered toiletries: real soap, shaving cream, razor blades, toothpaste, shampoo, combs, and mirrors. Prisoners could buy writing paper, pens, and envelopes to send letters home. They could purchase musical instruments, playing cards, board games, sports equipment, and craft supplies. Some canteens sold clothing items: work gloves, handkerchiefs, socks, undergarments. Others offered luxury goods like watches, rings, and wallets. At camps where prisoners worked in food processing, the canteens sometimes sold the very products the prisoners had helped produce: jams, preserves, canned goods, at prices lower than American civilians paid in regular stores. Sergeant Wilhelm Schmidt, a veteran of the Eastern Front captured in Tunisia, wrote in a letter to his wife, which German censors held up but American intelligence later obtained: "You will not believe what I'm about to tell you, and I would not believe it myself if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. There is a shop here, they call it a canteen, where we can buy things, not a few things, hundreds of things: chocolate, fruit, cigarettes for less than the cost of a single Reichsmark. I bought an orange yesterday." An orange? I haven't seen an orange since 1941. I stood there holding it, wondering if it was real or if I'd gone mad from the desert sun. The abundance wasn't accidental. The U.S. military deliberately ensured that POW canteens were well stocked, both to comply with Geneva Convention requirements, and because well-fed, reasonably content prisoners caused fewer problems than desperate, deprived ones. But the practical considerations masked something deeper. The canteens represented a fundamental American assumption that even prisoners of war were entitled to some level of consumer choice, some autonomy over their material existence, some participation in the market economy that defined American life. At Camp Concordia in Texas, the canteen operated from a converted warehouse. Prisoners would line up with their scrip, enter through one door, browse the aisles exactly as in a civilian store, make their selections, pay at a register where American soldiers served as cashiers, and exit through another door with their purchases. The entire process mimicked a civilian shopping experience, with only the armed guards and barbed wire visible through the windows to remind anyone that this was a prison camp. Ernst Hoffmann, still taking notes, observed the canteen dynamics with growing fascination. The canteen has created social stratification that mirrors and yet differs from our military hierarchy. Officers who receive more money buy different things than enlisted men. Some prisoners save all their wages and make large purchases: a radio, a musical instrument. Others spend everything immediately on cigarettes and sweets. A black market has emerged for certain high-demand items. Men trade, negotiate, loan money at interest. It's capitalism in miniature, and it works with a fluidity that challenges everything we were taught about how societies organize resource distribution. The psychological impact of the canteens went beyond mere material comfort. For many German prisoners, the canteen visits became the highlight of their week, a reminder that life involved more than simply existing, that pleasure and choice remained possible even in captivity. The act of earning money through work, deciding how to spend it, making purchases, and enjoying the results created a sense of agency that prison camp life typically destroyed. Some prisoners used their wages to buy materials for hobbies. At Camp Concordia in Mississippi, German POWs purchased woodworking tools and supplies, creating elaborate furniture, musical instruments, and decorative items. At Camp Trinidad in Colorado, prisoners bought art supplies and produced paintings that camp authorities later displayed in exhibitions. At Camp Ruston in Louisiana, prisoners purchased athletic equipment and organized competitive soccer leagues with uniforms, referees, and standings tables. The entrepreneurial-minded found opportunities. Some prisoners with barbering skills charged small amounts to cut hair. Others offered tailoring services, mending uniforms and adjusting fits for a few cents. Still others became camp bankers, offering to hold savings for prisoners who feared theft or lacked self-control with money. The American authorities generally tolerated these micro-businesses as long as they didn't disrupt camp order or involve forbidden activities. Not all canteen visits went smoothly. At Camp Dermot in Arkansas, a fight broke out when one prisoner accused another of cutting in line. At Camp Clark in Nevada, several prisoners attempted to purchase far more cigarettes than regulations allowed, hoping to trade them for other goods. Camp commanders occasionally had to adjust canteen policies when prisoners found creative ways to circumvent rules, buying items in bulk to resell at markup, pooling money to purchase goods collectively, or attempting to bribe guards with purchased items. But these were minor disruptions in a system that, remarkably, largely worked. By late 1943, the canteen system had become such an established part of POW camp life that German prisoners regularly wrote home about it, though German censors often deleted these passages, seeing them as Allied propaganda. The propaganda ministry couldn't decide how to handle the issue, acknowledged that German prisoners were being treated well, which made American captors look good, or suppressed the information, which left families of POWs in agonized ignorance. Oberst Weber, who had scoffed at the wages during that first day at the fence, visited the Camp Concordia canteen 3 weeks after arrival. He purchased a carton of Lucky Strikes, 2 Hershey bars, a bunch of bananas, the latest issue of Life magazine, and a fountain pen. The total cost was less than 1 week's wages. Standing outside the canteen, smoking a cigarette and eating chocolate, he looked at the items in his hands and said to no one in particular, "This shouldn't be possible." The labor that paid the wages. The wages and canteens existed because of genuine labor, hard, necessary work that filled critical gaps in the American wartime economy. By 1944, over 425,000 German POWs were held in the United States, spread across more than 500 camps in 44 states. They represented a massive labor pool at a time when American manpower was stretched desperately thin. American agriculture, in particular, faced a crisis. Millions of farm workers had entered military service or migrated to better-paying factory jobs in cities. Meanwhile, wartime demand for food had skyrocketed, feeding not just American civilians and troops, but also Allied forces worldwide and the massive Lend-Lease shipments to Britain and the Soviet Union. The mathematics were brutal. More food needed, fewer workers available. German POWs filled this gap across the agricultural heartland. In the sugar beet fields of Nebraska, Colorado, and Michigan, German prisoners bent over rows of plants, pulling and topping beets in work that was numbingly repetitive and physically exhausting. A single prisoner could process roughly 1 ton of sugar beets in a 9-hour day. Camps near beet-growing regions sent out work details of 50 to 100 prisoners daily during harvest season. The prisoners earned their 80 cents per day. The farmers paid the U.S. military the prevailing wage for such labor. The difference covered the costs of guarding, transporting, and managing the prisoners. In the cotton fields of Mississippi, Arkansas, Texas, and Louisiana, German prisoners picked cotton alongside local workers. The work required skill, pulling the cotton bolls without damaging the plant or mixing in too much plant material. But most prisoners learned quickly. A skilled picker could harvest 200 to 300 pounds of cotton in a day. The fields stretched to every horizon under a brutal southern sun, and prisoners learned quickly to respect the work that enslaved people had been forced to do for centuries, and that poor sharecroppers still performed. Forestry work took prisoners into the deep woods of Oregon, Washington, and the upper Midwest. They felled trees, operated sawmills, processed lumber, and maintained forest roads. In Michigan's Upper Peninsula, German prisoners worked in iron mines. In Pennsylvania and West Virginia, some worked in coal mines, though this practice was controversial and ultimately restricted due to safety concerns, and the work's direct contribution to war industries. Food processing facilities employed thousands of POWs. In California's Central Valley, prisoners worked in canneries, processing tomatoes, peaches, and other fruits into canned goods. They sorted produce, operated canning equipment, loaded trucks, and maintained facilities. In the Midwest, prisoners worked in meat-packing plants, grain elevators, and dairy facilities. The work was often cold, wet, and monotonous, but it paid the same 80 cents per day. The physical labor was real and demanding, but conditions differed dramatically from what prisoners expected. American workplace safety standards, while primitive by modern standards, far exceeded what German workers experienced under National Socialism. Work hours were regulated, typically 8 to 9 hours per day with breaks. Prisoners received the same food rations as American soldiers. Medical care was available for work-related injuries. Guards monitored conditions to prevent exploitation. Hauptmann Klaus Richter, working that sugar beet farm in Kansas, wrote a second letter that censors allowed through. "The work is hard, I won't pretend otherwise, but it's honest work, paid fairly. The farmer treats us like workers, not animals. At midday, his wife brings lunch, sandwiches, lemonade, sometimes cookies. She asks if we have enough. When one of our men injured his hand on a tool, the farmer immediately stopped work and drove him to the camp medical facility. This is how they treat enemy prisoners. What does that say about how they treat their own people?" Not all prisoners worked willingly. Camp commanders couldn't force officers to work under Geneva Convention rules, though many chose to work anyway, partly for the money and partly to relieve boredom. Among enlisted men, some refused work details for various reasons: political conviction, laziness, fear, or genuine medical conditions. These prisoners received only the minimal 10-cent daily allowance and couldn't accumulate canteen funds. Most eventually began working once they saw what they were missing. The economic impact of POW labor was substantial. A 1945 War Department study estimated that German POW labor contributed approximately $230 million to the American economy, equivalent to roughly $3.8 billion in 2025 dollars. Agriculture benefited most dramatically. An estimated 75% of POW labor went to farming. Without this labor, food production would have dropped significantly at precisely the moment when demand was highest. The arrangement created some awkward situations. In several cases, German POWs found themselves working alongside Italian POWs, who had switched from enemy to co-belligerent status after Italy's surrender in 1943. Tensions sometimes flared, but more often the prisoners simply did their work and collected their wages. At some camps in the South, German POWs worked in closer proximity to Black American civilians than would have been allowed in civilian society due to Jim Crow segregation, a situation that created its own complicated dynamics and lessons. A few prisoners became exceptionally skilled at their assigned work. At a lumber camp in Oregon, a German prisoner who had been a carpenter before the war became the facility's de facto foreman, teaching other prisoners proper techniques and maintaining quality control. He earned a reputation among the American managers as the best sawyer they'd ever employed. When his camp commander offered him an extra 10 cents per day in recognition of his skill and responsibility, he accepted with visible pride in work well done, regardless of the circumstances. The labor system wasn't without exploitation. Some private employers, especially farm owners, tried to extract more work from prisoners than they paid for. Some pushed prisoners beyond the regulated hours. Camp commanders had to monitor these situations carefully and occasionally banned prisoners from working for employers who violated agreements. The War Department took such violations seriously, not out of particular sympathy for German prisoners, but because the Geneva Convention specifically protected prisoner rights, and the U.S. military took its treaty obligations seriously. By 1944, the POW labor program had become so essential to certain sectors of the American economy that business groups lobbied Congress to keep German prisoners in the United States even after the war ended. Farmers in particular, having come to rely on steady POW labor crews, worried about how they would manage without them. The requests were denied. The Geneva Convention required repatriation promptly after hostilities ceased, but the lobbying effort revealed how thoroughly integrated POW labor had become into American agriculture. Ernst Hoffmann, assigned to administrative duties due to his language skills, had access to camp labor statistics. He recorded them with his characteristic precision. Camp Concordia provides approximately 500 laborers daily to local farms and facilities. Each laborer averages 7.5 hours of work daily. That's 3,750 labor hours per day from this single camp. Multiply by 500-plus camps across the country. The numbers become staggering. The Americans have turned their prisoner population into a significant economic resource, but they've done it while following international law and paying wages. This is organized efficiency on a scale I'm struggling to comprehend. The psychological transformation. The combination of wages, canteens, decent food, adequate shelter, and regulated working conditions created psychological effects that neither the German prisoners nor their American captors fully anticipated. Men who arrived at camps expecting harsh treatment, minimal food, and brutal conditions instead found themselves in an environment that, while certainly imprisonment, bore little resemblance to their propaganda-fed expectations. The transformation happened gradually, almost imperceptibly for many prisoners, but camp authorities documented the patterns. Medical officers noted that German POWs in American camps gained an average of 15 to 20 pounds during their first 6 months of captivity. The weight gain reflected adequate nutrition. Prisoners received the same food rations as American soldiers, approximately 4,000 calories daily, but also lower stress levels and less physical danger than they'd faced in combat. Camp psychologists and intelligence officers, tasked with monitoring prisoner morale and identifying potential security risks, noticed attitudinal shifts. The initial defiance and ideological rigidity that characterized newly arrived prisoners, especially those from elite units like the Afrika Korps or SS divisions, often softened after several months of exposure to American camp life. The change wasn't universal or uniform, but patterns emerged. At Camp McCain in Mississippi, intelligence officer Captain Robert Hartman conducted regular interviews with German prisoners to assess their attitudes. In a 1944 report, he noted, "The prisoners arrive with deeply ingrained beliefs about American weakness, racial inferiority, and the inevitability of German victory." After several months of earning wages, buying goods at the canteen, receiving adequate food and medical care, and working alongside American civilians who treat them decently, these beliefs begin to crack. They don't necessarily become pro-American. Many retain loyalty to Germany, but they begin to question the specific teachings of Nazi propaganda about what America is. The questioning often started with small observations. Prisoners noticed that black and white American soldiers sometimes worked together in ways that violated Nazi racial theories. They observed female officers giving orders to male soldiers and being obeyed. They saw Jewish chaplains conducting services and realized that Jews held positions of authority in the American military. These observations didn't necessarily change deeply held beliefs overnight, but they planted seeds of doubt. The canteen system played a particularly important role in this psychological shift. The act of earning money, making purchases, and exercising consumer choice, activities that seemed trivial, actually represented profound statements about individual agency and economic freedom. Under National Socialism, the state controlled material distribution through rationing, allocation, and political favoritism. Goods went to those deemed valuable to the state. Everyone else did without. Personal preference mattered little. Work served the Volk, not the individual worker. The American system presented a radically different model. Prisoners earned wages through their own labor. Those wages gave them purchasing power. They decided how to spend that power based on their own preferences. The system respected individual choice even for enemy prisoners. This wasn't charity or indoctrination. It was simply how Americans believed economic life should work, and they applied those principles even in prison camps. Sergeant Wilhelm Schmidt, who had been so amazed by the Orange, experienced this transformation firsthand. In a letter written 6 months after his initial missive, he reflected, "I've been thinking about what it means that they pay us. At first, I thought it was weakness, that Americans lacked the will to simply command and enforce. But I'm beginning to see it differently. They pay us because they believe labor deserves compensation. They run canteens because they believe even prisoners should have some choices about their own lives. These aren't signs of weakness. These are principles they actually believe in and follow. I don't know what to do with this understanding." Not all prisoners experienced this transformation. Hardcore Nazis remained hardcore Nazis, viewing American treatment as a contemptible failure to prosecute war properly. These prisoners often isolated themselves in camp factions, maintained rigid military hierarchies, enforced ideological conformity, and sometimes terrorized other prisoners who showed signs of wavering in their National Socialist commitment. Camp authorities had to maintain separate compounds for these black Nazis to protect other prisoners. But even among the ideologically committed, the American camp experience planted doubts. One anonymous prisoner, identified in intelligence reports only as Subject G457, was a committed SS officer who maintained his Nazi convictions throughout captivity. Yet in a monitored conversation with another prisoner, he said, "I hate that they treat us well. It would be easier if they were cruel. Cruelty I could understand, could use to reinforce everything we believe. But this decency, this following of rules even when it costs them, this treating enemies as human beings, I don't have a framework for it." The transformation had practical security implications. Prisoners who became comfortable in American camps were less likely to attempt escape, less likely to engage in sabotage, and more likely to cooperate with camp authorities. The U.S. military understood this dynamic and used it deliberately. General Archer Lurch, the Provost Marshal General who oversaw the entire POW system, stated in a 1944 memorandum, "Decent treatment of prisoners serves multiple purposes. It fulfills our treaty obligations. It encourages good treatment of American POWs in enemy hands through reciprocity. It reduces security problems, and it demonstrates to prisoners what a democratic society looks like in practice. All of these serve American interests." The religious and educational programs available in camps further contributed to psychological change. Prisoners could attend services conducted by chaplains, Protestant, Catholic, and occasionally Jewish. They could take courses in English, mathematics, history, and various trades. They could participate in theater productions, musical performances, and art exhibitions. Camp libraries stocked thousands of books in German. These programs weren't just humanitarian gestures. They were part of a deliberate strategy to expose German prisoners to ideas and experiences that challenged Nazi indoctrination. The Army's Special Projects Division developed curricula specifically designed to introduce democratic principles, critical thinking, and pluralistic values. The programs were voluntary. Prisoners couldn't be forced to attend, but many did, partly from boredom and partly from genuine curiosity. Ernst Hoffmann enrolled in an English course at Camp Concordia in late 1943. The instructor was a lieutenant who had taught high school English before the war. Hoffmann later wrote, "The lieutenant teaches us more than just language. He assigns us American short stories to read and discuss. He asks us what we think about them, genuinely interested in our opinions. When we disagree with him, he argues back but doesn't punish us for dissent." This is education as conversation, not indoctrination. I don't know if he realizes how radical this seems to men from a system where teachers existed to instill correct thinking, not to encourage independent thought. The medical care prisoners received further reinforced positive impressions of American society. Camp infirmaries provided treatment that met or exceeded what German soldiers received in the field. Prisoners with serious conditions went to U.S. military hospitals, where they received care from American doctors and nurses who treated them like any other patient. Several prisoners underwent surgery that saved their lives, surgery they would never have received in German POW camps. At a hospital in Texas, an American nurse named Margaret Henderson treated a German prisoner recovering from appendix surgery. She later recalled, "He kept thanking me, almost obsessively. Finally, I asked him why. He said that in his country, non-Aryans didn't receive full medical care, and he assumed America would be the same. When I told him we treated everyone equally, regardless of race or nationality, he cried." An enemy soldier, crying in a hospital bed because we gave him basic medical care. It made me realize how different our societies really were. The wage and canteen system remained central to this psychological transformation because it operated continuously, affecting prisoners' daily lives in concrete, tangible ways. Philosophical discussions about democracy versus totalitarianism remained abstract. Earning money and buying chocolate were immediate and real. The cumulative effect of these daily experiences, working for pay, shopping at canteens, making choices, seeing rules fairly applied, gradually reshaped how many prisoners understood the world. By late 1944, As the war turned decisively against Germany, the psychological divide between prisoners who had spent time in American camps and fresh arrivals from the collapsing fronts became stark. New prisoners brought recent propaganda and news of German wonder weapons that would turn the tide. Veteran prisoners, tanned from agricultural labor and well-fed from camp kitchens, listened skeptically. They had seen American abundance firsthand. They understood that a nation that could stock POW camp, canteens with hundreds of items, while fighting a two-ocean war possessed resources beyond anything Germany could match. The cultural collision. The wage and canteen system created unexpected cultural collisions that revealed deep differences between American and German societal assumptions. These collisions played out daily in mundane interactions that nonetheless carried profound meaning. At a work site in Iowa, a German prisoner detail worked alongside American civilian agricultural inspectors. During lunch break, one of the Americans offered to share his meal with a German prisoner whose lunch looked meager. The prisoner refused, explaining that accepting charity would be shameful. The American, confused, explained it wasn't charity, just sharing between working men. The prisoner finally accepted, but later told other prisoners, "They don't understand the concept of hierarchy. An American civilian treated me, an enemy prisoner, as an equal simply because we were working at the same site. This is either admirable or dangerous, and I can't decide which." The classlessness that characterized much of American society, especially in contrast to Germany's rigid social hierarchies, consistently surprised German prisoners. American guards called each other by first names regardless of rank when off duty. Officers sometimes pitched in with physical labor. Social interactions mixed ranks and backgrounds in ways that violated German military protocol. Lieutenant Hans Becker, a Luftwaffe pilot captured after being shot down over the Mediterranean, witnessed an interaction at Camp Blanding in Florida that stuck with him for decades. An American captain and a private were playing ping-pong in the camp recreation area during off-duty hours. The private won, and the captain congratulated him, bought him a Coke from the canteen, and they sat chatting as equals. Becker later said, "In the German military, an enlisted man would never casually defeat an officer in front of others, and if he did, there would be consequences. But these Americans competed, and when the junior man won, it was simply accepted as part of the game. Their lack of proper military bearing should have made them weak, but somehow it didn't." The racial dynamics in American society presented German prisoners with complicated lessons that often reinforced Nazi propaganda as much as challenged it. In southern states especially, German POWs sometimes observed or experienced the Jim Crow system firsthand. German prisoners could eat in restaurants where Black Americans couldn't. They rode in the front of buses while Black Americans sat in the back. They attended movie theaters from which Black Americans were excluded. These observations gave hardcore Nazi prisoners ammunition for their arguments about racial hierarchy. They could point to American segregation as validation of their racial theories. But the situation was more complex than simple validation. Many German prisoners also observed Black Americans working in positions of authority, military officers, camp administrators, medical personnel. They saw Black and white Americans cooperating in ways that contradicted strict racial separation. The contradiction confused prisoners more than it confirmed existing beliefs. At Camp Ruston in Louisiana, a German prisoner working detail encountered a Black American lieutenant who was the camp's assistant provost marshal. The prisoner initially refused to take orders from a Black officer, citing German military traditions. The camp commander quickly educated him. "You're in an American military facility now. You will follow orders from any American officer regardless of race. If you refuse, you'll lose all work privileges and canteen access." The prisoner complied, but the incident revealed the culture clash involved. The status of women in American society also challenged German prisoners' assumptions. Women worked in camp administration, drove trucks, operated equipment, and held positions of genuine authority. Female camp administrators made decisions that affected thousands of prisoners. Women in uniform gave orders that male soldiers followed. For prisoners from a society that had spent a decade pushing women out of public life and into purely domestic roles, kinder, Cooch, Kirch, children, kitchen, church, the American approach seemed bizarre and inefficient, yet it obviously worked. The camps functioned. The American economy produced at staggering levels. American military forces were winning the war. The disconnect between Nazi gender theories and observable American reality created cognitive dissonance for many prisoners. The religious pluralism of American society contrasted sharply with the German experience as well. In American camps, Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish chaplains all held services. Prisoners could attend any service or none. Religious identity didn't determine access to food, medical care, work assignments, or canteen privileges. This religious neutrality struck many prisoners as strange in Germany. Religious identity increasingly determined one's fate, with Jews marked for extermination, and even Christian opposition to the regime met with persecution. A Jewish chaplain, Captain Hermann Bernstein, regularly conducted services at camps in the Southwest. German prisoners could attend or not as they chose. Bernstein later wrote, "I was a Jewish officer conducting religious services in a camp full of German prisoners, many of whom had spent years being told that Jews were subhuman parasites who controlled and corrupted civilization. Yet there I stood, in an American uniform with captain's bars, conducting services that the American military fully supported. Some prisoners attended out of curiosity. Others came because they were questioning everything they'd been taught. A few came because, despite their indoctrination, they remained devoutly religious and would attend any service available. The camp authorities didn't care about the reasons. They simply provided the opportunity." The American emphasis on written rules and procedures also bemused German prisoners accustomed to a system where power often operated through unwritten codes and personal connections. In American camps, regulations were posted, procedures were documented, grievances had formal channels, and rules applied uniformly. When a prisoner violated camp regulations, he faced defined consequences through a structured process, not arbitrary punishment from an angry guard. This procedural formality created an atmosphere of predictability that many prisoners found oddly comforting. They knew what would happen if they broke specific rules. They could plan accordingly. The arbitrariness of Nazi governance, where one could be arrested for undefined crimes against the people, or where personal connections determined outcomes, was absent. The wage and canteen system embodied many of these cultural differences in concrete form. It represented American capitalism in miniature: individual labor, monetary compensation, consumer choice, market dynamics. It reflected American assumptions about individual agency and material life. It demonstrated American abundance and organizational capacity, and it operated according to clear rules that applied to everyone equally. Ernst Hoffmann synthesized many of these observations in a remarkable letter written in spring 1945. "I am beginning to understand that America isn't simply Germany with more resources. It's a fundamentally different kind of society with different organizing principles. They believe that individuals matter, that rules should be written and consistently applied, that work deserves fair compensation, that consumer choice is a good thing, that people of different backgrounds can cooperate effectively. We were taught these beliefs make societies weak and inefficient. But I'm living in a prison camp run on these principles, and it works better than many German institutions I experienced as a free man. This is an uncomfortable realization." The black market and economic ingenuity. The official wage and canteen system existed alongside an unofficial economy that prisoners created themselves. This shadow market revealed both the entrepreneurial spirit that exists in any human population and the limitations of even well-run institutional systems. Cigarettes became the primary currency of the camp black market. The canteens sold various brands at official prices, but within the camp economy, cigarettes functioned as money more reliably than scrip. A prisoner could trade cigarettes for virtually anything: extra food, tailoring services, artwork, tutoring, protection, or favors. The exchange rates fluctuated based on supply and demand, just like in any currency market. At Camp Como in Mississippi, an elaborate cigarette economy emerged. Prisoners who didn't smoke became cigarette brokers, buying cartons from the canteen and selling individual cigarettes at markup to prisoners who wanted to smoke immediately rather than wait for their next canteen visit. The brokers provided liquidity to the camp economy, and they profited from the spread. Other goods served as currency too. Coffee, chocolate, and canned goods all had established exchange rates. A Hershey bar might trade for 3 cigarettes, a can of fruit for 5, a bar of soap for 2. These rates were posted informally on camp bulletin boards, negotiated in barracks conversations, and adjusted based on scarcity and demand. Some prisoners engaged in sophisticated arbitrage. They would buy undervalued goods at the canteen, items that were plentiful but that other prisoners wanted, and trade them at higher values within the internal market. One enterprising prisoner at Camp Trinidad in Colorado realized that razor blades were consistently underpriced relative to demand. He systematically bought razor blades every canteen visit, accumulated a stockpile, and traded them at substantial markup to prisoners who'd run out between canteen trips. He functioned as both wholesaler and retailer, making a considerable profit in cigarette-denominated terms. The gambling economy operated parallel to the exchange economy. Poker, blackjack, and various dice games ran continuously in camp barracks. Stakes were usually cigarettes or canteen scrip, though sometimes prisoners wagered other valuables. The gambling created winners and losers, redistributing wealth within the camp population in ways that had nothing to do with work or camp wages. Camp commanders generally tolerated small-scale gambling as recreation, but large-scale operations that resembled organized crime attracted intervention. At Camp Alva in Oklahoma, a gambling ring became so sophisticated that it employed dealers, enforcers, and bookkeepers, functioning essentially as a casino. When authorities learned that the operation was intimidating non-gambling prisoners and creating security problems, they shut it down and transferred the ring's leaders to other camps. Loan sharking emerged as some prisoners ran out of money between paydays. A prisoner who spent all his wages immediately on cigarettes and candy might need to borrow from a prisoner who saved his wages. The loans typically carried interest. I'll lend you 3 cigarettes today, you pay me back 4 on payday. The interest rates could be usurious by civilian standards, but in a closed economy with no external lending options, borrowers paid what lenders demanded. Services became commodities too. Prisoners with valuable skills monetized them. Barbers charged for haircuts. Tailors altered and repaired uniforms. Artists created portraits, sketches, and decorative items on commission. Musicians gave lessons. Tutors taught languages, mathematics, and other subjects. The prices varied based on skill level and competition. A mediocre barber charged less than a skilled one. When multiple tailors operated in a camp, prices dropped through competition. Manufacturing operations sprang up as prisoners used materials from the canteen or work sites to create goods. At Camp Campbell in Kentucky, a group of prisoners bought leather goods from the canteen, disassembled them, and reconstructed the leather into wallets, belts, and small bags that they sold to other prisoners at considerable markup. The camp authorities only intervened when the manufacturing operation began stealing leather from the camp shoe repair shop. The most ambitious entrepreneurial prisoners created vertically integrated operations. At Camp Cook in California, one prisoner established a cigarette wholesaling business, buying large quantities from multiple canteen visits, storing them, and selling them for markup. A loan sharking operation, lending to prisoners who'd spent their wages too quickly, and a debt collection service, enforcing repayment of loans made by himself and other prisoners. He employed other prisoners as runners, storage managers, and enforcers. When camp authorities finally audited his operation, they discovered he controlled cigarette assets equivalent to several months of wages for a typical prisoner. Not all underground economic activity was peaceful. Thefts occurred regularly. Prisoners stole from each other, cigarettes, money, canteen goods, personal items. Camp authorities had to investigate thefts, identify perpetrators, and impose punishments. Repeated thieves lost canteen privileges or faced other sanctions. Protection rackets emerged in some camps, especially those with strong Nazi factions. Hardcore Nazis would demand payments from other prisoners in exchange for protection from harassment or violence. These rackets created genuine fear and forced many prisoners to hand over portions of their wages. Camp authorities struggled to address protection rackets because victims feared retaliation if they reported the activity. The underground economy revealed that even in a system designed to provide fairly for everyone's needs, human beings create additional layers of exchange, enterprise, and exploitation. The American authorities' response to this shadow economy was pragmatic. Tolerate harmless activities, intervene when activities became harmful or disruptive, and recognize that complete control of economic behavior was neither possible nor necessary. Ernst Hoffman, observing these dynamics with his characteristic analytical precision, noted, "The unofficial economy that operates alongside the official wage and canteen system demonstrates several things. First, that human beings are natural economic actors who will create markets wherever they exist. Second, that even a well-designed official economy can't satisfy all needs and wants, so people create supplementary systems. Third, that economic freedom, even in a prison camp, leads to both creativity and exploitation. The Americans seem comfortable with this complexity. They don't try to control every economic interaction. They set basic rules, intervene when necessary, and otherwise let people transact. This is probably how their entire society operates. The view from outside: American civilians and German POWs. The wage and canteen system didn't exist in isolation. It operated in an American society that had complicated feelings about paying enemy prisoners while American soldiers fought and died overseas. The interaction between German POWs and American civilians created friction, learning, and unexpected connections. In farming communities across the Midwest and South, German POW work details became familiar sights. Trucks loaded with prisoners rolled down country roads to work sites daily. Farmers worked alongside German prisoners in fields, orchards, and barns. The proximity created relationships that ranged from simple professional courtesy to genuine friendships, relationships that were controversial in communities where families had sons fighting in Europe. John Kraus, the Nebraska farmer who employed Hauptmann Richter and other German prisoners for sugar beet harvest, reflected in a 1947 interview. "At first, I didn't want them. These were enemy soldiers. My son was over there fighting their comrades. But I needed the labor and they worked hard, so I treated them professionally. Over time, I realized most of them were just regular men caught up in circumstances beyond their control. That didn't make them innocent. They'd fought for Hitler, but it made them human. When Richter asked about farming in Germany and I asked about his family back home, we were just two farmers talking, even though technically we were enemies." Not all American civilians shared Kraus's perspective. In some communities, employing German POW labor sparked resentment and protest. Families who had lost sons in combat sometimes objected strenuously to seeing German prisoners walking around relatively freely, earning wages, and living in decent conditions. Letters to local newspapers expressed outrage. "Why are we paying these Nazi thugs while our boys die? Why are they eating well while we deal with rationing?" The American military responded with two arguments. First, the Geneva Convention required decent treatment and fair wages. It was international law, not optional policy. Second, treating prisoners well encouraged reciprocal treatment of American POWs in enemy hands. These arguments didn't always satisfy grieving families, but they represented the official position. The racial dimensions of German POW treatment in the segregated South created particularly fraught situations. German prisoners could patronize establishments that excluded Black Americans. They rode buses in sections forbidden to Black citizens. They ate in restaurants where Black Americans couldn't dine. These situations created understandable anger in Black communities and highlighted the moral contradictions in American society. A Black newspaper, the Pittsburgh Courier, ran several editorials noting the bitter irony. German prisoners of war, men who fought for Hitler's racist regime, receive better treatment in the American South than Black American citizens whose fathers and sons are fighting and dying for this country. This is not just hypocrisy, it's a moral abomination. Some interactions between German POWs and American civilians led to lasting relationships. At Camp Algona in Iowa, a prisoner named Herman Kruse worked at a local farm owned by the Anderson family. After the war ended and Kruse returned to Germany, the two families maintained correspondence for decades. The Andersons helped the Kruse family during the difficult post-war years, sending care packages and money. In the 1950s, Herman Kruse's son came to Iowa as an exchange student and stayed with the Andersons. Other interactions were less harmonious. At Camp Weingarten in Missouri, a German prisoner working at a local canning facility made romantic advances toward an American woman who worked there. The incident created a scandal in the small town and nearly sparked violence. The prisoner was removed from the work detail, restricted to the camp, and lost all work privileges for 6 months. The incident reinforced local skepticism about employing POW labor in civilian facilities. American civilians who worked at POW camps had their own perspectives on the wage and canteen system. Many civilian employees, guards, administrators, truck drivers, kitchen staff, earned wages lower than or comparable to what they would make in civilian jobs, Yet they saw German prisoners earning money and buying luxuries at canteens. This created resentment among some civilian workers. Martha Williams, who worked as an administrative clerk at Camp Hearn in Texas, later recalled, "I earned about $30 per week, and I was supporting my family because my husband was overseas fighting. I saw German prisoners earning their 80 cents a day, which wasn't much, but they had no expenses, no rent, no utilities, no food costs. Every cent they earned could go to cigarettes and candy. Meanwhile, I was scraping by. It bothered me, but I understood the reasons. We were following the law, treating them as we hoped our POWs would be treated. But understanding it intellectually didn't always help emotionally. The canteen system sometimes created opportunities for unauthorized exchanges between prisoners and civilians. Guards would occasionally accept bribes, usually in goods purchased from the canteen, to smuggle items into or out of camps, deliver messages, or provide other forbidden services. These infractions, when discovered, usually resulted in the guards' dismissal and prosecution. In a few cases, German prisoners and American civilians developed relationships that violated both regulations and social norms. Several documented cases involved romantic relationships between German prisoners and American women. These relationships were illegal, scandalous, and in some cases continued after the war when prisoners returned to Germany and the women followed. The most famous case involved a prisoner named Georg Gattner, who escaped from a work detail in New Mexico in 1945 and lived in the United States under assumed names for 40 years, eventually marrying an American woman and building a life in California. When he revealed his identity in 1985, it created a media sensation and raised questions about the effectiveness of POW camp security. Children's interactions with German POWs were particularly complex. In rural areas where POW work details operated, local children would sometimes see German prisoners working in fields or loading trucks. Some children were frightened. These were the enemy, the people killing American soldiers. Others were curious, approaching prisoners to practice German language skills from school or simply to see the exotic enemy up close. At one camp in Wisconsin, a local Girl Scout troop visited to perform songs for the prisoners as part of a morale program. The experience was awkward for everyone involved. Children singing cheerful songs to enemy soldiers, prisoners trying to be gracious, adults supervising with mixed feelings. But it represented the American impulse toward humanitarian treatment even of enemies, an impulse that often clashed with the realities of war and loss. American servicemen who worked as camp guards had perhaps the most complicated relationship with the wage and canteen system. They were in charge of men who were recently trying to kill Americans, yet they had to treat these men fairly, ensure they received their wages, facilitate canteen visits, and generally operate as jailers who followed rules rather than meted out revenge. Corporal James Delacroix, a guard at Camp Concordia, wrote to his brother serving in Italy, "It's strange. I guard these Germans every day. I know they fought against us, that men like them killed Americans. But day to day, they're just men who work, earn money, buy things at the canteen, and try to get through each day. I can't hate them continuously. It's too exhausting. So mostly I just do my job, make sure they follow rules, and try not to think too hard about the bigger picture." The end of the war and repatriation. As Germany collapsed in spring 1945, the dynamics in American POW camps shifted dramatically. News of Allied advances, German cities destroyed, the concentration camps liberated, and finally Hitler's suicide and German surrender reached prisoners through newspapers, radio broadcasts, and guard conversations. The wage and canteen system continued operating, but its meaning changed as prisoners grappled with Germany's defeat and their uncertain futures. For hardcore Nazis, the defeat was incomprehensible or attributed to betrayal. They clung to beliefs about Germany's superiority and destiny, blaming the defeat on conspiracies, traitors, or overwhelming Allied numbers rather than fundamental problems with National Socialism itself. These prisoners remained hostile, maintaining Nazi hierarchies and discipline in camps even after the war ended. For prisoners who had begun questioning Nazi ideology during their captivity, Germany's defeat confirmed their emerging doubts. The comfortable life in American camps contrasted sharply with reports of Germany's devastation. The wage and canteen system, which had seemed odd or weak when they arrived, now appeared as evidence of systematic differences between democratic and totalitarian societies. Ernst Hoffmann, ever the analyst, wrote a remarkable reflection in May 1945. Germany is defeated. Our cities are rubble. Millions are dead. The concentration camps have been revealed, the full horror of what was done in our name. I sit in a prison camp in Kansas, well-fed, earning wages, buying fruit at a canteen, and I have to confront what these comforts mean. America didn't defeat us through brutality or fanaticism. They defeated us through organization, production, democratic cooperation, and yes, fundamental decency even toward enemies. The wages and canteens weren't propaganda or tricks. They were expressions of actual American values, values that proved more effective than ours. The repatriation process began slowly. Geneva Convention required that POWs be repatriated without delay after active hostilities ended, but American authorities interpreted this flexibly. Germany was devastated, divided into occupation zones, and facing potential famine. Simply shipping hundreds of thousands of POWs back immediately would create humanitarian and logistical crises. American authorities developed a phased repatriation process that stretched into 1946 and beyond. Prisoners were sorted by various criteria. Those accused of war crimes were separated for investigation and potential prosecution. Those deemed least Nazi indoctrinated were repatriated first. Those needed for labor in Germany's reconstruction were prioritized. The rest followed in waves determined by logistical capacity. During this extended period, the wage and canteen system continued. Prisoners kept working, earning money, and buying goods. But the context had fundamentally changed. They weren't POWs waiting out a war that might still be won. They were Germans whose country had been destroyed, preparing to return to an uncertain future. Some prisoners wanted to stay in America. The thought of returning to ruined Germany, to likely hunger and hardship, compared unfavorably to the stability of camp life. A small number of prisoners formally requested permission to remain in the United States, though such requests were usually denied. America had its own veterans returning and reclaiming jobs. There was little appetite for German prisoners staying permanently. The repatriation itself was organized efficiently. Prisoners assembled at collection points, underwent final processing, turned in their canteen scrip, and boarded trains that took them to ports where ships waited. The camps that had held them were dismantled, sold for scrap, or converted to other uses. The last major group of German POWs left the United States in 1946, though some remained longer. Those held for war crimes investigations, those used as labor in reconstruction efforts with ongoing wage compensation, and a handful who managed to disappear into American society like Georg Gattner. Hauptmann Klaus Richter, who had arrived at Camp Concordia so skeptical of American softness, departed in March 1946. In his final letter from the camp, he wrote, "I returned to Germany a different man than I arrived. Not because America converted me through propaganda, but because living here made me question everything I'd been taught about how societies work, what makes nations strong, what causes people to cooperate effectively. I earned wages as a prisoner. I bought oranges and chocolate. I was treated according to written rules that applied equally to everyone. These experiences can't be undone. Whatever I find in Germany, whatever I do with the rest of my life, I'll carry these memories and the questions they raised." Legacy and lessons. The German POW wage and canteen system left a complex legacy that historians are still evaluating. On the surface, it was simply America following Geneva Convention requirements during wartime. But examined more closely, it represented something broader, a test of whether democratic principles and humanitarian values could be maintained even toward enemies during total war. The numbers tell part of the story. Over 425,000 German POWs passed through American camps. They earned wages totaling approximately $22 million in 1940s dollars, roughly $365 million in 2025 dollars. They contributed an estimated $230 million in labor to the American economy. No comprehensive statistics exist on total canteen purchases, but individual camp records suggest prisoners spent millions on goods ranging from cigarettes to musical instruments. More significantly, the system demonstrated that humane treatment of POWs was both practically achievable and strategically valuable. German POWs in American camps died at a rate of less than 1%, far lower than American POW death rates in German camps, 3.5%, or horrifically lower than American death rates in Japanese camps, 37%. The low death rate reflected adequate food, decent shelter, available medical care, and regulated working conditions. The treatment of German POWs in America influenced post-war developments in multiple ways. Former POWs returned to Germany carrying memories of American society that shaped their views of democracy, capitalism, and international relations. In the decades after the war, many former POWs became advocates for German-American friendship and reconciliation. Some entered politics and business with perspectives shaped partly by their POW experiences. Camp experiences also influenced American thinking about prisoner treatment. Military planners and international law experts studied the POW system to identify what worked well and what needed improvement. The lessons learned in American POW camps during WWII informed later military doctrine about prisoner handling, influenced U.S. positions in negotiations about updates to the Geneva Conventions, and shaped policies in subsequent conflicts. Not all the lessons were positive. The relative comfort of German POWs in American camps contrasted painfully with how America treated Japanese Americans during the same period. Tens of thousands of American citizens of Japanese descent were incarcerated in camps that, while not as brutal as POW camps in Germany or Japan, involved forced removal from homes, loss of property, and harsh conditions, all without the due process that even enemy POWs received. This comparison highlighted uncomfortable truths about American racism and the selective application of principles. The wage and canteen system specifically demonstrated that treating people, even enemies, as economic actors with agency produced better outcomes than purely coercive approaches. Prisoners who earned wages and could make consumer choices were more productive workers, easier to manage, and more likely to cooperate with camp authorities than prisoners who received nothing and had no stake in the system. From an economic perspective, the system showed that humanitarian treatment and practical efficiency weren't contradictory. Paying prisoners' wages cost money, but it generated more value in labor than it cost in wages and canteen operations. Well-fed, reasonably content prisoners worked harder and caused fewer security problems than desperate, resentful prisoners. The moral case and the practical case aligned. The psychological impact proved perhaps most significant. Prisoners like Ernst Hoffmann and Klaus Richter returned to Germany carrying lived experiences of a different way of organizing society. They had earned wages for their labor. They had made consumer choices. They had been treated according to transparent rules applied equally. These experiences didn't necessarily make them pro-American or even anti-Nazi in all cases, but they introduced doubts and questions that no amount of Allied propaganda could have created. Oberst Friedrich Weber, the skeptical officer from the opening scene, didn't survive the war. He was repatriated to Germany in late 1945, returned to a destroyed country and a broken society, and died in 1947 under circumstances that remain unclear. But before his death, he reportedly told his son, "I was wrong about the Americans, not wrong about everything. They made mistakes, had contradictions, weren't perfect. But I was wrong to dismiss them as weak. What I thought was weakness was actually strength of a different kind, and I lacked the wisdom to recognize it." Ernst Hoffmann had a different trajectory. He returned to Germany, worked in reconstruction efforts, eventually became a teacher, and in the 1960s corresponded with some of the American guards and administrators from Camp Concordia. In one letter, he wrote, "I spent nearly 3 years as a prisoner in America, and those years taught me more about political philosophy and economic systems than my entire education in Germany. Not because anyone lectured me about democracy, but because I lived in a small-scale version of a democratic capitalist society and could observe how it worked in practice. The wages weren't just money. They were lessons in how free societies organize human cooperation." Klaus Richter became a farmer in West Germany, eventually hosting American exchange students on his farm in the 1970s. He told them stories about working on American farms as a POW, being paid wages, buying oranges at the canteen. The students, born long after WWII, found the stories almost unbelievable, that America had paid enemy soldiers, let them shop in camp stores, treated them according to rules. Richter would smile and say, "It happened. I was there, and it changed how I understood the world." Conclusion: the mathematics of values. The story of German POWs who couldn't believe they were paid wages and spent them at camp canteens. ultimately reveals something profound about the relationship between values and power. When Oberst Weber stood at that fence in June 1943, he saw the wage system as confirmation of American weakness. He understood military might, industrial capacity, and ideological commitment. He didn't understand that paying prisoners wages and running canteens demonstrated something more powerful than any of those factors, a commitment to principles even when expedience might suggest otherwise. The mathematics that Weber cited so confidently in 1943, German military victories, technological advantages, ideological certainty, proved ephemeral. The real mathematics were different. American industrial production that dwarfed German capacity, democratic cooperation that proved more effective than totalitarian command, and humanitarian values that strengthened rather than weakened American society. The wages themselves were modest, 80 cents per day, barely enough to buy cigarettes and candy. But they represented something larger, recognition that even enemy prisoners possessed dignity and deserved fair treatment. The canteens were small retail operations in prison camps, but they embodied American assumptions about consumer choice, individual agency, and material abundance. The entire system operated according to rules, not arbitrary power, a distinction that prisoners from a totalitarian regime found shocking. This isn't to romanticize American wartime conduct. The same nation that paid German POWs fairly also interned Japanese Americans unjustly, maintained rigid racial segregation in the South, and would later engage in conflicts where humanitarian principles weren't always upheld. American treatment of German POWs represented American ideals at their best, not America's consistent practice. But the POW wage and canteen system does reveal what's possible when values are taken seriously even in difficult circumstances. It showed that following international law during war is achievable. It demonstrated that treating enemies humanely serves practical purposes while fulfilling moral obligations. It proved that democratic principles can be maintained without sacrificing effectiveness. June 1943. Friedrich Weber had laughed at American wages and canteens as signs of weakness. May 1945. Germany lay in ruins, its ideology discredited, its military destroyed, its society shattered. The mockery at Camp Concordia's fence had indeed become a historical miscalculation, not because America possessed better weapons, though it did. Not because America had more soldiers, though it did. But because America organized its society around principles that proved more resilient, more productive, and ultimately more powerful than the totalitarian alternative. The lesson endures, dismissing societies as weak because they follow rules, underestimating nations that treat even enemies humanely, assuming that democracy is inefficient and soft. These miscalculations invite disaster. The wages and canteens weren't propaganda or tricks. They were authentic expressions of American values, and those values, tested in the crucible of total war, proved stronger than the ideologies that opposed them. The final accounting doesn't lie in dollars and cents, though the economic numbers are impressive. It lies in the transformation of men like Ernst Hoffmann and Klaus Richter, who arrived at American camps as convinced Nazis and departed as men with questions, doubts, and alternative visions of how societies could work. It lies in the demonstration that humanitarian treatment of prisoners is both morally right and practically effective. It lies in the proof that democratic values aren't luxuries to be abandoned under pressure, but strengths to be maintained especially when tested. Friedrich Weber couldn't believe America would pay POW wages and run canteens because he understood power only as domination, strength only as ruthlessness, and organization only as coercion. He failed to grasp that alternative forms of power exist, power rooted in principles, strength drawn from voluntary cooperation, organization built on consent rather than force. That failure of understanding cost him and his nation everything. The men who worked for wages, who bought oranges and chocolate at camp canteens, who were treated according to rules they could read and understand. These men learned lessons that propaganda never could have taught. And those lessons, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of German POWs, planted seeds that would grow in the decades after the war into a transformed Germany that embraced democracy, rule of law, and integration with the very nations it had fought. The wages were 80 cents per day. The canteens sold cigarettes and candy. The impact lasted generations. That's the mathematics that matter, not kill ratios or production statistics, but the power of values consistently applied, even toward enemies, even during war. Weber's laughter at the fence became history's lesson about the strength of principles and the danger of mistaking humanity for weakness.